Okay, so as Peter already mentioned, I'm going to be talking about the international negotiations, and I have to say that, as those of you who are my students in the audience would know, ordinarily I could spend, I paid them to do that. I could spend 10 minutes answering a question, let alone presenting the big picture for the international negotiations. But I really just wanted to set the stage and give a sense of the parameters of the discussion today. So it struck me that perhaps not everyone would be familiar with the basic legal framework that we're talking about when we talk about these negotiations and the meeting that's coming up in Copenhagen. And the important thing to keep in mind with the legal framework in relation to climate change is that there are really two major treaties that form the foundation for it. On the one hand, we have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a treaty that was concluded in 1992 at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. Negotiations on that started in early 1991, so we're now almost at 20 years of climate change negotiations and counting. What the Framework Convention on Climate Change did was establish an overarching way for the international community to address the problem of climate change. It did set out very clear objectives, principles, and mechanisms that the international community could use. What it also did was set what could be considered to be a soft target. It encouraged Annex 1 or developed country parties to stabilize their emissions levels at around 1990 levels. So there was a great deal of hope in the process leading up to the Climate Change Convention that we would have binding emissions reduction commitments for developed country parties. That did not materialize, largely because of US opposition, but not exclusively. But we did have at least a general commitment to attempt to stabilize. We then have the Kyoto Protocol, which again is the treaty that is much more familiar to most people, although it's a piggyback agreement. It builds on the foundation established by the Framework Convention. The Kyoto Protocol, as you're no doubt all aware, does establish binding emissions reduction commitments for Annex 1 parties, which are basically developed country parties. As you also are probably aware, it sets out quite a wide range of individual targets. The cumulative or aggregate target for all developed country parties is about a 5% reduction from 1990 levels, but the individual parties all take on very different obligations under the protocol. And of course, mostly what we hear about the protocol are its failures, the fact that many states are not, and in fact, living up to their obligations under the protocol. So what's going to be culminating, we hope, in Copenhagen at the United Nations Climate Change Conference is really, all right, are negotiations under two separate negotiating tracks. One under the convention and one under the protocol. And that makes things very complicated. On the one hand, this is something that is reflected in what has been called the Bali Roadmap, something that came out of the climate change conference held in Bali in 2007. On the one hand, it set up a new, and you get very used to these types of language in international environmental negotiations, an ad hoc working group on long-term cooperative action under the convention. And then you also had an existing ad hoc working group on further commitments for Annex 1 parties under the Kyoto Protocol. And so you have these two negotiating tracks that have continued since the Bali meetings and have had a large number of meetings, generated hundreds and hundreds of pages of material. I don't know if any of you have actually tried to work your way through that material. Very dense stuff, very complex, and covering a very wide range of issues. Just to give you a sense of what the LCA, the Ad Hoc Working Group on Long-Term Cooperative Action, has to deal with, under something called the Bali Action Plan, which was actually a decision of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention, it set out a number of different features of what it wanted this working group to arrive at. One of them is something called a shared vision for long-term cooperative action. You'd be astonished by how much ink has been spilled on what that shared vision should constitute, in part based on this whole idea of overall aggregate targets. Action on mitigation, how climate change can be mitigated, action on adaptation. Adaptation has come to play an increasingly important role in the international discussions, as of course it's now clear that we're in the process of having to adapt to climate change, and that is likely to get even more significant as time goes by. There's also discussions on technology, specifically technology transfer from the countries, the developed countries to the developing countries, as well as financial assistance. So resource flows from the north to the south to finance both adaptation but also mitigation actions. And finally, there's a discussion about capacity building and how capacity building can be utilized in order to enable countries to respond more effectively to climate change. Under the protocol, I haven't listed anything, but I can tell you that the discussions are similarly complex. Of course, the main purpose of the discussions under the protocol is to try to figure out what happens after 2012. The first commitment period under the protocol was 2008 to 2012, and the idea is we have to have a further set of commitments, or at least many parties feel we have to have a further set of commitments under the protocol. So part of it is just targets that is being discussed there, but also what can be done to achieve the targets that might actually be set. So, and this is in fact my last slide. So if you were thinking, oh boy, this is going to go on and on. There are a number of different issues and obstacles, and I could have gone on this particular slide for 15, 20, 30 slides about the issues and obstacles, but I really just wanted to highlight a few in the I think 3 minutes that I have left. First of all, as I already mentioned, the relationship between these two, in themselves, very complex negotiating tracks. The main difficulty, perhaps, is the fact that the United States, which is a party to the Framework Convention, is not a party to the Kyoto Protocol. So discussions about developed country parties are going on under the Kyoto Protocol Working Group, but discussions about U.S. commitments are going on under the Convention Working Group. And there's been significant calls on the part of some parties to combine those two tracks and simply to say we can't deal with U.S. obligations and developing country commitments in isolation from the commitments and obligations of other developed countries. The issue of targets for developed countries, you'll have no doubt seen in the newspaper this week that the U.S. has finally committed to a target of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020, something that falls far below the range of 25 to 40% that many developing countries were hoping to see. Is also significantly lower than, say, the 20% reduction from 1990 levels that the EU has committed to. So something that is really, I think, going to be a huge source of discussion and debate. Differentiated obligations between developed and developing countries. This has perhaps been the #1 issue that has been scrutinized and raised in the media. The fact that many commentators feel that there must be some form of action by developing countries. This is something that the Bali Action Plan actually recognized in the form of what are referred to as nationally appropriate mitigation actions. Developing countries have taken an active role. Many developing countries have taken an active role. China, again, this week has announced a target for reduction in carbon intensity from 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2020, which is being hailed as a real breakthrough. The one thing that remains is that developing countries as a group have been very resistant to the idea of taking on legally binding commitments, because they feel that developed countries must take a leadership role in this regard. This was something that was enshrined in the Framework Convention and that is regarded as a matter of equity and basic justice. And finally, the issue of differentiation amongst developing countries. Obviously, there's a real problem with assuming that you can group together China and, say, Bolivia, and therefore there's been some discussion of how we can actually find a way of differentiating among the various developing countries, many of which, of course, in some ways could almost be treated as developed countries. Again, often a major sticking point, because for developing countries, the issue of solidarity has been an important theme going back to the 1960s. Also because of a view that this is really seen as a way of eroding the commitment to developed country leadership, which, as I mentioned earlier, is so important. I believe I'm now out of time, am I not? So I will leave you with that, but hopefully at least I've given you some sense of some of the things that are going to be at the table, on the table at Copenhagen.
Excellent. Okay. Thank you very much.